December 30th, 2025. Saudi warplanes streak across the morning sky over southern Yemen, their targets locked on a port facility in the coastal city of Mukalla. Within minutes, explosions tear through the harbor. Not Iranian weapons, not Houthi militants, but 80 military vehicles belonging to Saudi Arabia's closest Gulf ally, the United Arab Emirates. The strike sends shockwaves far beyond Yemen's borders, marking the moment when two of the Middle East's most powerful nations transform from partners into rivals in what may become the most consequential rift in modern Arab history. For years, the headlines told us one story. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, united brothers, standing shoulder to shoulder against regional threats. Together, they intervened in Yemen to push back Iranian-backed Houthis. Together, they blockaded Qatar over allegations of supporting extremism. Together, they formed the backbone of Gulf security and prosperity. But beneath that carefully maintained facade, a different reality was taking shape. One that exploded into public view in the final days of 2025, reshaping the geopolitical landscape of an entire region. The real story behind Saudi Arabia's refusal isn't about a single decision or a momentary disagreement. It's about a fundamental reimagining of power, sovereignty, and influence in the Middle East, playing out across multiple battlefields from the deserts of Sudan to the strategic waters of the Red Sea, from the fractured state of Yemen to the contested recognition of Somaliland. And at its core lies a question that will define the region for decades to come. Can two nations that once saw themselves as natural allies coexist when their visions for the future have become fundamentally incompatible? To understand how we arrived at this extraordinary moment, we need to rewind the clock. Just a decade ago, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi weren't just allies. They were the twin pillars of a regional order built on shared fears and common enemies. The Arab Spring uprisings had sent tremors through every monarchy in the Gulf. The specter of political Islam, embodied by groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, threatened to upend traditional power structures. And Iran's growing influence across the region, from Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen, posed what both kingdoms saw as an existential threat to Sunni Arab dominance. Their response was coordinated and aggressive. In March 2015, Saudi Arabia and the UAE led a coalition of Arab states into Yemen, launching Operation Decisive Storm with the stated goal of restoring the internationally recognized government and rolling back Houthi advances. It was supposed to be quick, surgical, decisive. 9 years later, Yemen remains shattered. The Houthis control most of the north, including the capital Sana'a, and the coalition that was meant to stabilize the country has itself become a source of chaos and division. But even as the bombs fell on Yemen, deeper fault lines were beginning to emerge. The UAE, despite its smaller size, had grand ambitions. Abu Dhabi wasn't content to play second fiddle to Riyadh's regional leadership. Instead, it charted an increasingly independent course, one that would eventually put it on a collision path with Saudi interests. The first major divergence came in 2017 with the Qatar blockade. While both Saudi Arabia and the UAE accused Doha of supporting terrorist groups and cozying up to Iran, their motivations differed. For Saudi Arabia, it was about reasserting regional dominance and punishing a wayward neighbor. For the UAE, it was about crushing the Muslim Brotherhood and any other form of political Islam that might threaten absolute monarchy. Then came 2020 and the Abraham Accords. The UAE's decision to normalize relations with Israel without demanding progress on Palestinian statehood was revolutionary. But it also exposed the growing gap between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. The UAE positioned itself as pragmatic, forward-looking, willing to break with decades of Arab consensus in pursuit of economic opportunity and strategic advantage. Saudi Arabia, constrained by its role as custodian of Islam's two holiest sites in Mecca and Medina, couldn't afford such boldness. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman may have privately supported normalization, but he made clear that for Saudi Arabia, any deal with Israel would require meaningful progress toward a Palestinian state. This wasn't just about optics or religious sentiment. It revealed a fundamental difference in how the two nations saw themselves and their role in the region. The UAE, with a population of just over 9 million and no pretense of being the leader of the Arab or Islamic world, could afford to be transactional, pragmatic, opportunistic. Saudi Arabia, with 36 million people and responsibility for billions of Muslims worldwide, had to think in terms of legitimacy, leadership, and long-term stability. But it was in the proxy conflicts scattered across the region where these differences became most dangerous. Take Sudan, where a brutal civil war has killed at least 100,000 people and displaced millions more. On one side stands the Sudanese armed forces, led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, backed by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and increasingly Iran. On the other, the Rapid Support Forces, a powerful paramilitary group led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemedti, supported by weapons, funding, and training from the United Arab Emirates. The UAE's support for the RSF isn't accidental or casual. According to intelligence assessments and investigative reporting, Abu Dhabi has funneled Chinese-made armed drones, heavy machine guns, mortars, and artillery to the paramilitary force. In February 2026, Reuters revealed that the UAE had financed and staffed a secret training camp in Ethiopia, where 4,300 RSF fighters were being prepared for combat. The weapons flow through a carefully constructed logistics network, utilizing ports in Somaliland, airfields in Libya's Al Kufra, and supply routes through Chad, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic. One analyst described it as encircling Sudan in a ring of fire. For Saudi Arabia, this isn't just about choosing sides in a distant conflict. Sudan sits directly across the Red Sea from the kingdom's western coastline. The stability of Sudan, control over its Red Sea ports, and the nature of whatever government emerges from this war have direct implications for Saudi security and for Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's ambitious Vision 2030 development plans. Major Saudi investments in tourism and infrastructure along the Red Sea coast depend on regional stability. A fragmented Sudan, carved up into competing spheres of influence and dominated by militias rather than a coherent state, represents a nightmare scenario for Riyadh. More fundamentally, Saudi Arabia sees the UAE's strategy as reckless and destabilizing. By backing paramilitaries and non-state actors, Abu Dhabi is, in Riyadh's view, normalizing the fragmentation of sovereign states, replacing legitimate governments with patchworks of armed groups loyal to external patrons. And nowhere has this pattern become more explosive than in Yemen itself. Yemen was supposed to be the ultimate symbol of Saudi-UAE cooperation. Instead, it became the stage for their most dramatic confrontation. Throughout the long years of war, while both nations officially supported the internationally recognized government against the Houthis, they increasingly backed different factions on the ground. Saudi Arabia threw its weight behind the government based in Aden and led by the Presidential Leadership Council. The UAE, meanwhile, cultivated the Southern Transitional Council, a secessionist movement seeking to restore the independent state of South Yemen that existed before unification in 1990. The STC wasn't just another militia. It represented a fundamental challenge to Yemen's territorial integrity, something Saudi Arabia viewed as essential for its own border security. The Hadramaut and Mara governorates that the STC captured in early December 2025 don't just contain oil wealth, they share a direct border with Saudi Arabia. From Riyadh's perspective, allowing the UAE to carve out an independent southern Yemeni state on its doorstep, led by forces loyal to Abu Dhabi rather than to any Yemeni government, crossed a red line that couldn't be uncrossed. The STC offensive, codenamed Operation Promising Future, was stunning in its speed and scope. Launched on December 2nd, the campaign saw separatist forces seize control of most of the 6 governorates that once formed South Yemen within just a week. They captured the cities of Sayan and Tarim in Hadramaut, pushed into neighboring Mara, and established de facto control over vast stretches of southeastern Yemen. Saudi Arabia responded with increasingly urgent warnings, demanding the STC withdraw and accusing the UAE of dangerous escalation. But the warnings went unheeded. On December 30th, Saudi patience ran out. Coalition warplanes struck the port of Mukalla, destroying what Saudi military spokesman Major General Turki al-Maliki described as more than 80 vehicles and containers of weapons and ammunition being transferred from Emirati vessels to UAE-backed forces. The UAE claimed the shipments were destined for its own counterterrorism units and contained no weapons. Saudi Arabia wasn't buying it. In an unprecedented public statement, the kingdom accused the UAE of exerting pressure on the STC to conduct military operations that threatened Saudi national security, warning that any such threat was a red line and that Riyadh would not hesitate to take all necessary measures. The rhetoric was extraordinary. These weren't diplomatic euphemisms or carefully worded complaints. This was one major Arab power publicly accusing another of undermining its national security and threatening military action. The Yemeni government, backed by Saudi Arabia, ordered all UAE forces to leave the country within 24 hours, announced a 72-hour blockade, and declared a 90-day state of emergency. The UAE announced it would voluntarily withdraw its remaining forces. The STC leader, Idris al-Zubaydi, was removed from his position on the Presidential Leadership Council, charged with treason, and fled to the UAE. By January 9th, facing a Saudi-backed government counteroffensive, the STC announced its dissolution. But if anyone thought this was just about Yemen, they weren't paying attention. The same pattern of Saudi-UAE competition was playing out across the Red Sea and Horn of Africa region. In Somalia, tensions flared when Israel recognized the breakaway region of Somaliland in late December 2025. Saudi Arabia joined scores of Muslim and Arab countries in condemning the recognition. The UAE's name was conspicuously absent from that list. Why? Because Abu Dhabi has been working closely with Somaliland for years, including building a military base there and developing port facilities that give the UAE strategic access to the Gulf of Aden. This wasn't a new relationship. The UAE had been cultivating ties with Somaliland since at least 2016, investing in the port of Berbera and establishing what many analysts believed was a military installation capable of hosting surveillance assets and potentially naval vessels. For Somalia's central government in Mogadishu, this represented a direct challenge to its sovereignty and territorial integrity. But for the UAE, Somaliland offered something invaluable: a friendly port on the African side of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, giving Abu Dhabi eyes and influence over one of the world's most strategic waterways. The Israeli recognition of Somaliland added another explosive element to the equation. Reports suggested the move was linked to Somaliland authorizing an Israeli military or intelligence presence, potentially to monitor Houthi activity across the water in Yemen. For Saudi Arabia, this looked like another piece of a disturbing puzzle: the UAE establishing a network of loyalist territories and assets around the strategic Bab el-Mandeb Strait and Red Sea shipping lanes, now potentially in coordination with Israel. The geographic implications were profound. Control over the Bab el-Mandeb means control over access to the Suez Canal, one of the world's most important trade routes. Roughly 30% of global container traffic passes through this narrow waterway. Any disruption, whether from Houthi attacks, piracy, or geopolitical competition, sends ripples through the global economy. For Saudi Arabia, watching the UAE and potentially Israel establish a presence on both the Arabian and African shores of this critical strait raised fundamental questions about who would control the sea lanes that Saudi prosperity depends on. The geographic pattern was unmistakable. From Sudan to Yemen to Somalia, the UAE appeared to be constructing what analysts called a maritime empire, a string of ports, bases, and client forces that could control or influence some of the world's most critical shipping routes. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, through which passes a significant share of global oil shipments and traffic bound for the Suez Canal, sits at the intersection of these interests. For Saudi Arabia, watching the UAE extend its influence across both shores of the Red Sea triggered alarm bells about who would ultimately control the sea lanes that Saudi oil, trade, and future tourism depend on. The Abraham Accords added another explosive dimension to the rivalry. The UAE's relationship with Israel isn't just diplomatic, it's become deeply integrated across defense, intelligence, technology, and trade. Israeli defense exports to Abraham Accords countries reached $791 million. Trade between Israel and the UAE has soared into the billions. This created a strange new dynamic where Saudi Arabia found itself increasingly isolated from a UAE-Israel axis that seemed to be coordinating on regional security issues. From Riyadh's perspective, this looked like the UAE choosing sides, and not their side. Saudi commentators began describing the UAE in harsh terms previously reserved for enemies. References to Abu Dhabi as an Israeli Trojan horse and accusations of betrayal of God, his messenger, and the nation appeared in Saudi media. One prominent Emirati scholar responded by calling Saudi military action in Yemen no act of heroism. These weren't fringe voices, they were respected analysts and officials reflecting how deeply the relationship had deteriorated. The Trump administration's return to power in January 2025 created both opportunities and complications. President Trump's first foreign visit in his previous term had been to Saudi Arabia, where he spoke of the need to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a prerequisite for broader normalization. His administration had brokered the Abraham Accords, creating a special bond with the UAE. Now, in his second term, Trump found himself caught between two allies with increasingly incompatible visions. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's visit to Washington in November 2025 became a turning point. Multiple sources reported that MBS used the meeting to lobby President Trump to increase pressure on the UAE over its role in Sudan, possibly even seeking sanctions against the RSF or measures to curb Emirati support. Whether or not Trump committed to action, the message was clear. Saudi Arabia was no longer content to manage its disputes with the UAE quietly. It wanted American backing for its position. The Saudi strategy went beyond lobbying. In January 2026, Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan traveled to Cairo to coordinate with Egypt on constraining UAE operations. The two countries reportedly agreed to restrict Emirati use of their airspace for cargo flights suspected of supplying the RSF. They pressured Libyan General Khalifa Haftar, himself previously a UAE ally, to disrupt smuggling routes through Libya's Al Kufra airport. Saudi Arabia announced partnerships with Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan to counter UAE influence, a coalition that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. The Saudi-Turkish rapprochement was particularly striking. Just a few years ago, Turkey and Saudi Arabia were on opposite sides of most regional conflicts, with Ankara supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and movements Riyadh saw as threatening. Now, they were finding common ground in opposing UAE adventurism. Saudi Arabia even appeared to be moving closer to Qatar, another former adversary, united by shared concerns about Emirati regional ambitions. The The old camps and alliances of the past decade were being reshuffled in real time. For the UAE, this emerging coalition represented a serious challenge. Abu Dhabi had spent years building influence through supporting non-state actors, establishing port facilities, and cultivating direct ties with local forces, rather than working through central governments. This strategy had given the UAE outsized influence relative to its small size and population, but it had also created powerful enemies, and a reputation for unreliability among states that valued sovereignty and stability. Egyptian officials, who had long received Emirati financial support, were now expressing frustration with UAE policies in Sudan and elsewhere. Turkey, which had clashed with the UAE across Libya, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Horn of Africa, saw an opportunity to constrain its rival. Even smaller states in the region began to recalculate their relationships, wondering whether alignment with the UAE was worth the risk of alienating the much larger and wealthier Saudi Arabia. The question everyone in the region was asking, what does the UAE want? The answer is more complex than simple expansionism. Abu Dhabi's foreign policy reflects a particular worldview shaped by its unique position. As a small state with enormous wealth but limited military power, the UAE has pursued what analysts call a risk acceptance strategy of influence projection. Rather than relying on traditional diplomacy or military might, it cultivates dependable local partners, often paramilitaries or non-state actors, who can advance Emirati interests without requiring direct UAE troop commitments. This approach has had successes. UAE-backed forces helped recapture territories from extremist groups in Yemen. Emirati support for various factions has given Abu Dhabi a seat at the table in conflicts from Libya to the Horn of Africa. The UAE's willingness to break with conventional wisdom and pursue bold initiatives like the Abraham Accords has made it an indispensable partner for countries like Israel and the United States seeking pragmatic engagement in the region. But the strategy has costs. By empowering militias and secessionist movements, the UAE has been accused of fueling the very instability it claims to be combating. Reports from the United Nations and human rights organizations have documented atrocities committed by UAE-backed forces, particularly the RSF in Sudan and various militias in Yemen. The UAE denies directly arming these groups or being responsible for their actions, but the evidence of Emirati involvement is extensive and well documented. There's also an ideological component to UAE policy that can't be ignored. Abu Dhabi sees political Islam, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood and its affiliates, as an existential threat to monarchical stability. This puts the UAE at odds not just with Qatar and Turkey, which have supported Brotherhood-linked movements, but increasingly with Saudi Arabia, which has its own complex relationship with Islamist groups like the Islah Party in Yemen. The UAE's characterization of the Sudanese armed forces as Muslim Brotherhood-aligned, while portraying the RSF as a dependable anti-Islamist force, reflects this ideological framing. For Saudi Arabia, the calculus is different. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 requires regional stability, not just to attract foreign investment, but to transform the Saudi economy beyond oil dependence. The kingdom is investing hundreds of billions of dollars in megaprojects like NEOM, the Red Sea tourism developments, and efforts to position Saudi Arabia as a global hub for technology and finance. None of this works if the region descends into fragmentation and perpetual conflict. Saudi Arabia's preference for state-based solutions over militia proxies reflects this priority. Riyadh wants coherent governments in neighboring countries that can maintain order, honor agreements, and provide the stability necessary for long-term economic planning. A Sudan divided between a UAE-backed militia and a state army, a Yemen fractured into competing regions, a Somalia where the internationally recognized government competes with a breakaway Somaliland that has UAE backing, these outcomes represent failure from a Saudi perspective. The economic dimension of the rivalry can't be overlooked. Both Saudi Arabia and the UAE are massive oil exporters competing for investment, tourism, and regional economic leadership. But the competition goes far beyond oil. Dubai has positioned itself as the Middle East's premier financial hub, a glittering metropolis where East meets West, where business thrives, regardless of political turbulence elsewhere in the region. Its airlines, Emirates and Fly Dubai, connect the world. Its ports handle staggering volumes of trade. Its real estate market attracts global capital. Its reputation for efficiency, openness, and stability makes it a magnet for multinational corporations and wealthy individuals alike. Saudi Arabia wants to change that equation. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 explicitly aims to diversify the Saudi economy away from oil dependence and position the kingdom as a competitor to Dubai's regional dominance. Massive projects like NEOM, a futuristic megacity planned for the country's northwest, and ambitious Red Sea tourism developments are meant to show that Saudi Arabia can offer everything Dubai does, but bigger and better. The kingdom has loosened social restrictions, allowed concerts and cinema, and opened up to international tourism in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. But there's a chicken and egg problem. To attract the investment in tourism that Vision 2030 requires, Saudi Arabia needs regional stability and an improved international image. The war in Yemen, the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and concerns about human rights have all damaged the kingdom's reputation. Meanwhile, the UAE's first mover advantage with the Abraham Accords gave it access to Israeli technology, investment, and expertise that Saudi Arabia lacks without normalization of its own. Israeli firms are helping the UAE with everything from cybersecurity to agricultural technology to artificial intelligence. That partnership has accelerated Emirati economic development in ways that leave Saudi Arabia playing catch-up. The competition extends to sovereign wealth funds and international investments. Both countries control enormous pools of capital through their sovereign wealth funds. Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, with assets approaching $1 trillion, is one of the world's largest institutional investors. The UAE's various funds, including Abu Dhabi Investment Authority and Mubadala, collectively control comparable sums. These funds compete for the same high-profile investments, from technology companies in Silicon Valley to sports franchises in Europe to real estate developments around the world. When they're working together, this capital can reshape markets. When they're competing, it drives up prices and creates inefficiencies. There's also the simple matter of pride and precedent that can't be quantified in dollars or barrels of oil. Saudi Arabia is by far the larger country, with a population 4 times that of the UAE and an area roughly 30 times as large. More importantly, Saudi Arabia possesses the religious legitimacy that comes with custodianship of Islam's 2 holiest sites in Mecca and Medina. Every year, millions of Muslims make the pilgrimage to these cities, reinforcing Saudi Arabia's special status in the Islamic world. This gives the kingdom both influence and responsibility that the UAE simply doesn't have. From Riyadh's perspective, the idea that the UAE could pursue independent policies that directly threaten Saudi interests is fundamentally unacceptable. One Saudi advisor put it bluntly when he wrote about the structural imbalance in the Gulf between a big Saudi Arabia and smaller rivals, a comment that infuriated Emirati officials who saw it as bullying. The events of late 2025 and early 2026 have fundamentally changed how the region operates. The Yemen confrontation demonstrated that Saudi Arabia is willing to use military force against UAE-backed assets. The coordination with Egypt to restrict UAE access to airspace and disrupt supply lines to the RSF in Sudan shows a willingness to impose real costs on Emirati regional activities. The diplomatic offensive to build an anti-UAE coalition suggests this is a sustained strategy, not a temporary spat. For the United States, the situation is particularly awkward. Both Saudi Arabia and the UAE are critical American allies. The UAE hosts American military facilities and cooperates closely on counterterrorism. Saudi Arabia is America's oldest Arab partner and a linchpin of Gulf security. Now these 2 allies are on opposite sides of multiple conflicts, putting pressure on Washington to choose or to mediate. The Trump administration's relationships with both countries make this even more delicate. Trump's personal and business ties to both Saudi and Emirati leadership create both opportunities for mediation and potential conflicts of interest. The broader implications are staggering and touch virtually every dimension of regional and global affairs. Saudi Arabia and the UAE together account for a massive share of global oil production. Saudi Arabia alone produces roughly 10 million barrels per day, making it the world's 2nd largest oil producer after the United States. The UAE adds another 3 million barrels daily. Together, they represent about 15% of global oil supply. Any disruption to their production or to the security of their export routes could send oil prices soaring, with cascading effects on global inflation, economic growth, and political stability worldwide. They sit near 2 of the world's most critical maritime choke points. The Strait of Hormuz, through which passes about 21 million barrels of oil per day, roughly 21% of global petroleum consumption, lies at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Any conflict that closes or restricts this waterway would constitute a global economic emergency. The Bab al-Mandeb Strait, though less critical for oil, handles enormous volumes of container traffic bound for or coming from the Suez Canal. The Houthi attacks on shipping in this area during 2023 and 2024 demonstrated how quickly disruptions can force ships to reroute around Africa, adding weeks and enormous costs to global supply chains. Even limited military confrontation between Saudi Arabia and the UAE would send shockwaves through these systems. Insurance rates for shipping would spike, oil traders would price in risk premiums, companies would reconsider investments in the region. The global economic recovery from pandemic disruptions and inflation could be derailed by energy price shocks emanating from the Gulf. And the precedent of 2 major Arab oil producers engaging in direct conflict would shatter assumptions about Gulf stability that underpin countless economic and strategic calculations. Their combined investment pledges to the United States and Europe run into the trillions of dollars. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 alone envisions investments in economic activity worth trillions over the coming decades. The UAE's investments in Western technology, infrastructure, and institutions are similarly massive. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They represent jobs, innovation, and economic growth in countries from America to Britain to Germany. They fund university research, drive venture capital into startups, and purchase advanced weapon systems that keep defense industries humming. A sustained Saudi-UAE confrontation that forced Western countries to choose sides or restricted. The flow of Gulf capital would have significant economic consequences, far beyond the Middle East. Their alignment or division shapes the possibilities for Arab-Israeli peace, Iranian containment, and stability from North Africa to the Horn of Africa. The Abraham Accords were predicated on the idea that pragmatic Arab states could normalize relations with Israel based on shared interests, particularly regarding Iran. If Saudi Arabia and the UAE are at odds, with the UAE maintaining close ties to Israel, while Saudi Arabia conditions normalization on Palestinian statehood, the Abraham Accords' pathway to broader Arab-Israeli peace becomes much more complicated. Israel finds itself in the awkward position of being close to one major Arab power, the UAE, while being unable to reach agreement with the other, Saudi Arabia, whose participation would be far more significant given its size and religious authority. The rift also threatens efforts to address some of the world's worst humanitarian crises. In Sudan, the breakdown of the Quad mediation effort, which included Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and the United States, has left the country without effective diplomatic engagement, even as the death toll climbs past 100,000 and millions face starvation. The September 2025 humanitarian truce proposal went nowhere because the parties couldn't agree and the external mediators couldn't present a unified front. The RSF claimed to accept it. The Sudanese armed forces rejected it, saying they would only agree when the RSF withdrew from civilian areas. But without Saudi and Emirati cooperation, there was no mechanism to verify compliance or enforce consequences. The human cost is staggering. Entire cities have been destroyed in the fighting. Khartoum, once a bustling capital of 5 million people, has been reduced to a battleground where bodies lie in the streets and basic services have collapsed. The RSF's conquest of El Fasher in October 2025 was accompanied by reports of mass atrocities, including ethnic cleansing against the Masalit community in West Darfur. The United Nations and human rights organizations have documented systematic sexual violence, deliberate targeting of civilians, and the use of starvation as a weapon of war by both sides, but particularly by the RSF. In Yemen, the competition between Saudi and Emirati proxies has complicated efforts to achieve a lasting ceasefire and political settlement, even as the population suffers from what was already described as the world's worst humanitarian crisis even before the recent escalation. The December 2025 fighting between government forces and the STC killed hundreds and displaced tens of thousands more people who were already living in desperate conditions. Aid organizations struggled to reach affected areas during the fighting and blockade. The collapse of the STC doesn't solve Yemen's fundamental problems. It just removes one faction from a conflict that still pits the Houthis against a weak government with limited territorial control. The humanitarian situation in Yemen defies comprehension. After nearly a decade of war, more than 21 million people, 2/3 of the population, need humanitarian assistance. Millions face acute food insecurity. Healthcare systems have collapsed. Cholera and other preventable diseases kill thousands. Children die of malnutrition while armed groups compete for territory and resources. The Saudi-UAE rivalry adds another layer of complexity to peace efforts that were already struggling to gain traction against the backdrop of Houthi attacks on shipping and Israeli strikes on Houthi positions. In Somalia, competing outside interventions risk prolonging instability and state fragmentation in a country that has known little peace since the early 1990s. The UAE's support for Somaliland undermines Somalia's central government and emboldens other separatist movements. Saudi Arabia's support for Mogadishu might provide the government with resources, but it also ensures that the competition will continue. In central Somalia, exploits the chaos to expand its influence and launch attacks. Somali civilians caught between a weak government, a separatist region backed by foreign powers, and a brutal insurgent movement pay the highest price for this geopolitical competition. Some analysts believe the current confrontation could be the beginning of a fundamental realignment in Middle Eastern politics. If Saudi Arabia succeeds in building a coalition including Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, and Pakistan aligned against UAE policies, it would represent an unprecedented shift. The UAE would face isolation from major regional powers, potentially forcing Abu Dhabi to reconsider its approach. Alternatively, the UAE could double down, relying on its relationship with Israel and seeking support from other external actors. There are also scenarios where the two sides find a way to de-escalate. Neither Saudi Arabia nor the UAE wants direct military confrontation. The economic costs of sustained hostility would be enormous. Shared threats, from Iran to Houthi attacks on shipping, could force pragmatic cooperation even amid strategic competition. The United States and other Western partners have strong incentives to push for reconciliation. But reconciliation would require addressing the fundamental issues that drove the rift in the first place. Saudi Arabia would need assurances that the UAE won't continue to back secessionist movements in areas Riyadh considers vital to its security. The UAE would need confidence that it can pursue its strategic interests without facing Saudi obstruction. Both sides would need to agree on acceptable boundaries for proxy competition and rules for engagement in contested spaces like Sudan, Yemen, and the Horn of Africa. As of February 2026, there are few signs of reconciliation. Saudi media continues to criticize UAE policies. Emirati officials remain defiant. The ground reality in Yemen, Sudan, and elsewhere reflects continuing competition. And the broader regional context creates more incentives for aggressive pursuit of interests, rather than compromise. The story of Saudi Arabia's refusal is ultimately a story about power, sovereignty, and competing visions for the Middle East's future. It's about whether the region will be organized around strong states with clear borders and centralized authority, as Saudi Arabia prefers, or whether a more fluid arrangement of non-state actors and external influence will prevail, as UAE policies seem to enable. It's about who gets to define what stability looks like and who has the right to shape outcomes in countries far from their own borders. For the millions of people caught in the middle, in Yemen's shattered cities, in Sudan's displacement camps, and Somalia's contested territories, these geopolitical games have life and death consequences. The weapons that Saudi Arabia and the UAE funnel to their proxies kill real people. The diplomatic failures to achieve ceasefires condemn populations to continued suffering. The competition for influence happens at the expense of those who simply want peace and security. The refusal that made headlines, Saudi Arabia's decision to strike UAE-linked assets and demand a withdrawal, was just the most visible manifestation of a deeper rupture. Behind that single dramatic moment lies years of diverging interests and competing ambitions. Two nations that once seemed destined to shape the region together are now locked in competition that could define Middle Eastern politics for a generation. How this unfolds, whether through confrontation, accommodation, or something in between, will help determine whether the 21st century Middle East moves towards stability or deeper fragmentation. And that story is still being written, day by day, in the halls of power from Riyadh to Abu Dhabi, and in the contested territories where their proxies clash.